Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. It is my distinct pleasure and honor to welcome you to a conversation hosted by the Grand Challenge Initiative, Racial Justice, the Third Reconstruction at Vanderbilt University. This initiative comes from Vanderbilt University with the lead researcher, Professor Paul Taylor, W. Alton Jones, professor in philosophy, and it is supported also by Eric Ritter, who is a postdoctoral research fellow, and he's here today. I would like to thank Millions of Conversation for hosting us and promoting the event, our panelists, Professor Karla McKanders at Vanderbilt, and Sabina Mohyuddin who will be talking today, and I'll do the introductions for everyone. I would like to thank my colleague, Professor Rebecca Van Diver from the Art History Department, who has helped prepare this panel. So we will go as follow. Well, my name is Vesna Pavlović. Let me introduce myself. And I am an artist and professor at Vanderbilt Department of Art. I guess I land here, and I'll talk about that briefly after I introduce the panelists, as someone whose work in photography deals with issues of memory and representation and history. And so I would like to go ahead and start by introducing the panelists with their short bios, and then ask a few questions and moderate the conversation between us. Also, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat. We will be able to moderate those questions later on. So Karla McKanders is a clinical professor of law at Vanderbilt University Law School, where she directs the Immigration Practice Clinic and teaches immigration and refugee law and critical race theory. Her work has taken her throughout the US and abroad, teaching and researching the efficacy of legal institutions charged with processing migrants and refugees. Under her supervision, her law students provide direct representation to asylum seekers and unaccompanied minors who cannot afford counsel. In fall 2020, she was appointed the Associate Director of the Vanderbilt Legal Clinic. McKanders clerked for Judge Damon J. Keith with the United States Federal Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit after earning her law degree at Duke University and her undergraduate degree at Spelman College. Thank you, Karla.
Thank you.
And Sabina Mohyuddin is a Bangladeshi American Muslim born and raised in Nashville, Tennessee. She graduated from Vanderbilt University, our alumna, in '93 with a degree in mechanical engineering. She's an active member of the Muslim community, participating in interfaith and youth programs. In 2010, Sabina helped launch the Sons and Daughters of Abraham Project, which brings Muslim, Christian, and Jewish youth across Middle Tennessee together through interfaith dialogue and outreach programs. Sabina has published a number of articles in the Tennessean and was an outspoken critic of the 2011 anti-Sharia bill in the Tennessee State Legislature. She's a founding board member of the American Muslim Advisory Council, and now serves as the executive director of AMAC, which empowers the Tennessee Muslim community through civic engagement, community building, and media relations. She serves as the chair of the AMAC's yearly Empowering Women Conference, and additionally, Sabina serves on the board of the National Organization of Workforce Diversity, which helps promote diversity in the workplace, and on the board of the League of Women Voters Nashville. Lastly, in 2020, Sabina was inducted into the WYCA Academy of Women Achievement, and in 22 received the Trailblazer Award with the Metro Council Minority Caucus. She's the alumna of the American Muslim Civic Leadership Institute, Muslim Power Building Project, and Leadership Nashville. Currently lives in Nashville with her family. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
These are amazing women we have here, and scholars, and so I really am excited to start off a conversation simply by telling something about my personal experience with immigration, and maybe start from that very personal perspective, because that is why I'm moderating the panel also. So I am from Serbia, from former Yugoslavia, and during the 1990s, at the time of the dissolution of Yugoslavia, I lived there. I worked as a photographer, and many of my projects really reflected on the issues of war and wartime and migration and refugees. And so at that time, many have left the country, mostly young people, and emigrated to different parts of the world, Australia, Canada, everywhere, United States. And one of the writers, David al-Bahari, who is a well written and well spoken and translated, he emigrated to Canada, and he's the one who we associate with the word apatrid. He coined that term. So apatrid is this person with who has left homeland but came to a new homeland, and so that sense of belonging between two places, and actually not belonging anywhere fully, or living in between two places, is something that I feel, but also associate with, but also carrying that idea of a homeland from somewhere and bringing it somewhere else. And so I want to start with this idea of belonging to two different places, this idea or not belonging. And so I would like you to speak both from your own personal perspectives, maybe tell us about the work you do, and consider this notion of how does your work facilitate the working with people who find themselves not belonging or belonging in two different places. So Sabina, do you want to start, or Karla?
Thank you, Vesna, for that introduction and the question, because I think with the work that I do with the American Muslim Advisory Council, I mean, we advocate for the Muslim communities, and we help empower them. And we know that really to feel empowered is to feel that you belong in the communities you live in the country that you live in, right? And so that's always a question that's on our mind, on our, that we have to think about for our community, for the Muslims. I mean, and specifically we work with Muslims in Tennessee, is what is their sense of belonging? Well, their sense of belonging comes from their sense of being accepted in society as they are. And I think that's very critical, because there's always this idea, you know, we talk about in America that immigrants need to come in and assimilate. And assimilation is racist to the core, because you're really asking people, when you say you need to assimilate, is you need to give up parts of your identity to come into this idealized, right? This idealized American identity, because there's not one single American identity. And, you know, but there's this pressure for groups. And a lot of times Muslim community is just kind of framed as being immigrant group, but we're not purely immigrant group. We have a large African American community, yet they too are seen as not American enough, right? And it, you know, being able to fully embrace your religious identity, your cultural background, where you came from, what your ancestry is, and live in this country is key to your success in being empowered. Because if you're always kind of navigating how do I fit here? Do I fit in here? Am I seen as you know, just another neighbor in your community or not? Am I otherized? Will then feed into the whole, you know, how well you can navigate society, how well you can navigate resources, and but we know that, and you know, going ahead of myself, but you know, just the way the systemic racism works against our community really holds us back and keeps us from going forward and keeps us continuously questioning, do we belong? And you know, what is our place? Do we have to give up what, you know, parts of our identity to navigate those systems?
Thank you for raising the question, and this question of belonging and homeland and in between. It definitely is aligned with my story from a different angle as an African-American woman. You know, growing up in the United States, I, you know, witnessed my grandparents, you know, living in the segregated South, my parents moving to the North and not fitting in or belonging, or, you know, laws that didn't allow them to have certain jobs. And when I was in undergrad, I studied abroad in Strasbourg, France during the late 90s. And just by coincidence, I ended up working in a refugee center with Afghan nationals who were fleeing Afghanistan during the 90s. And what was made it, you know, when you travel abroad, often you learn more about your country. And, you know, it helps us to understand how we're all interconnected. And I, you know, made some connections in terms of the ways in which the immigrant community in France was residentially segregated from the rest of the community, the ways in which they were isolated and didn't have access to resources. And that made me reflect on the ways in which, you know, growing up in the United States, you know, I haven't felt as if I have belonged, because as Sabina mentioned, there's this norm, this normalcy of racism that pervades the United States. And that norm is a white norm that colors how we all should be and how we all should fit in. And so, you know, when I came back from Strasbourg, France, I, you know, continued to work with immigrant communities and, you know, decided to become an immigration law professor. I think immigration is extremely important, and it's not often acknowledged how our immigration laws, even back to the first naturalization law in 1790, constructed race, constructed who is a, you know, white person. If we look back to the you know, first naturalization cases where individuals from Japan, individuals from Syria were arguing, I should be able to naturalize because I am white. In those cases, judges are not relying on scientific evidence, but relying on, you know, social common knowledge to determine who is white. And that's important because we see our borders are racialized, and our borders, who gets to come in, you know, who gets to apply for asylum is highly racialized. Who gets to come in on, you know, a visitor's visa without submitting an application has been racialized over the course of our history. And so, you know, as a immigration scholar and practitioner, I, you know, examine the ways in which, you know, our immigration laws contribute to this normalcy of racism in the United States. And what Sabina was saying, echoing in terms of, you know, assimilation, just reinforces this idea that there is this white norm to which everyone must conform. And certainly that permeates our immigration laws.
Thank you both. Speaking of citizenship and the naturalization process is actually, you know, like I myself became a citizen in 2017 here in Nashville, actually, after 2 rounds of green cards and like, oh, it's time to renew again. Or where is the, you know, how to go? And I did it by myself, you know, going through the paperwork, and it wasn't easy. And so I felt, okay, it was time. And you know, it happened here in Nashville in the courtroom on Broadway. And at one point there were 60 of us that day, that morning. and everybody had to stand up and say where we're from. And we came from 40 different countries just that morning. And so I thought, like, well, that is a snapshot of Nashville. I mean, it really was at that time, like 40 different nationalities in one moment, and which sort of was really a powerful moment when we all had to stand up and say where we're from. And so I want to maybe talk a little bit about this moment in time and the moment of crisis that seemed to be perpetual, and we are experiencing from afar, and maybe not so from afar for you, the war in Ukraine, and we are hearing about staggering numbers of refugees, and it seems like it's a catastrophe that's evolving. And so I want to maybe address the policy, the immigration policy, both in times of war and peace. So what it means for you to work on a daily basis, like so what is your like daily work with and how do you manage to stay ahead of a developing crisis? Because it seems that it was yesterday that Afghani population had to flee the country when the US forces pulled out, and the war has ended, but it never ends, because I know that for many of my friends who are everywhere around the globe, that war in the 1990s is perpetual. Like it's in us. And so how do you deal with immigration crisis, and what are some of the mechanisms that you employ in terms of policy when it comes to times of peace and when it comes to time of war?
Often as an immigration lawyer, the times of peace and war may be similar, because there are always I've been practicing immigration law for 15 years, and there are always ebbs and flows of individuals who are individuals in crisis moments that need assistance. And, from, I think it was around 2014, we had unaccompanied minor children coming to the state of Tennessee who were from Central America, who needed representation. When I first started practicing, I was representing a lot of Iraqi nationals who were coming to the United States. And then also in the state of Tennessee, I think when I first moved here, there was a raid at the Pilgrim's Pride poultry plant in Chattanooga. And, I was involved with different organizations and organizing representation. And so I think that, each crisis moment, as we are labeling it, has a different tone and tenor. And at the same time, I think that there are two different ways in which I, as an immigration lawyer who is also an academic, works in this space. I think there are addressing the individual who me and my students represent, and how to marshal resources for the particular community that we're representing. And I think with each community, there are different issues. For example, the Haitian nationals who have moved to Nashville are having a really hard time finding representation, and they have been placed in deportation proceedings. They have really bad, there's not language access. Afghan nationals that Sabina, I've been, working on the legal side of representing Afghan nationals who have resettled to Nashville. Also, language access issues are a big issue in legal representation. Finding attorneys is a big issue. Since I've been in the state of Tennessee, legal representation is very thin. There aren't that many immigration lawyer practitioners within the state of Tennessee and in Nashville. So at each crisis moment that we face, there's always a scramble in the state of Tennessee to find attorneys who can provide legal assistance in helping individuals to navigate through the system. And also, with the Ukrainian nationals, an announcement was made that temporary protected status would be granted to anyone who was in the United States on the date that temporary protected status was announced. And so then there's another moment where on the legal advocacy side, people are trying to marshal resources to help people to navigate filling out forms. And so the times of war and peace it's, as an immigration attorney, it's hard to differentiate because there are always moments where communities are in need of, legal assistance. And so I think there's the individual who's in front of you. And then, when you get a chance to take a breather as an attorney from those individual moments, it's really evaluating how does the system operate? How does the system, in terms of our immigration laws, our executive branch policies, how are they operating? And are they operating in a manner that honors the humanity of all immigrants and refugees by not having, disparate policies towards certain groups?
Thank you. Sabina, would you like to say?
Oh no, I think Karla is the expert on that. It seems like sometimes you can't catch your breath between crisis, and because there's so much work in between, and sometimes what is deemed as a crisis is what's in the media. I mean, obviously the war in Ukraine and then the evacuations back in August of Afghanistan, those are crisis situations, but things are happening at the border. People aren't being given that opportunity to apply for asylum, or what happens if you come here alone applying for asylum. What is your safety net as you're waiting for those applications to go through, especially if you don't know anyone here. And so there is always seems to be a crisis situation, and I think, as Karla said, we don't have enough immigration lawyers in Tennessee, and Tennessee has been seeing an increase in refugee populations and resettlement, and we need it, and then having lawyers or services that are in the languages that the clients need. So those are systemic issues that need more resources behind to solve, and I think that lack of resources is showing, and trying to advocate for more for these communities.
Thank you, Sabina. Yes, and I think that those are kind of moments that and maybe I did not put it right. I sort of wanted us to, because it seems that it's a perpetual moment, and that you have to work continually, and that what we define as a crisis is different at different contexts, and it's a sort of an ongoing work. And I wonder, Karla, and both of you and Sabina too, you mentioned the devaluation of the system, and I know that Karla, I read, and I mean, Sabina, I read about the Muslim Day on the Hill activity and action that you take, and so I wonder about this kind of the laws, the politics, and the administration, and how does, because we've had, I mean, and again, it's a continuous process, and I'm not definitely an expert to know, but I certainly could feel the Trump years, and I could feel and we all read about the assault on immigration and the border and the wall, and so how does the change of administration or the politics enact in your daily efforts? So maybe Karla, if you want to talk about the students, and your work with students, and the clinic, and what that practically means for the immigrants, and maybe Sabina, you could add about that day, which seemed like an effort to really work with the legislation and to present and to have a voice, and how do you have and make sure that you have a voice in the state of Tennessee and beyond?
I think what is interesting about our immigration system is that even back to, if we go back to the Chinese Exclusion Act, the kind of hallmark of the system is that the political branches have wide discretion over our immigration laws. And what that means is that immigration laws have often been cloaked in what we call neutrality. And the immigration laws, they might, from like the original travel ban of the Chinese Exclusion Act, might exclude an entire nationality or ethnicity of people. But if you go back to the Chinese Exclusion Act cases, the reasons that were given by Congress for those acts were on the basis of sovereignty. And we see the same argument being made in the travel ban cases, which became known as the Muslim ban cases, in terms of, this is a facially neutral policy, and it is, proposed in order to protect sovereignty and national security. I think that is like the baseline where we have to assess the ways in which each administration, going from Clinton up until Biden, the wide discretion that they have to change immigration policies is baked into the system, that the political branches should be able to control who comes in and out of the United States, which has often led to the exemption from constitutional norms for immigrant communities. And it's in that light in which my students are working on cases. And so some of the things that we face, no matter what administration is in power, is that immigration officers have wide discretion to immigration officers and judges have wide discretion to say, no, this person doesn't qualify for asylum. No, this person should not be granted lawful permanent resident status. And the ability to appeal their decision is very strictly and severely limited. And so if you look across the country, my students are always appalled by the fact that, within one asylum office or within one immigration court, the Atlanta Immigration Court has a 0 grant rate, or probably maybe 1% grant rate on asylum cases. And there was a report that just came out about the Boston Asylum Office and the discrepancies between each asylum officer granting asylum. And so, my work with my students, again, is kind of framed in, how do we represent the individual that is before us, and then by also recognizing the narratives that we have to put forth in order to get a person granted relief are often misaligned with who that person is. We often have to present our clients as victims who are asking, the United States to save them and grant asylum. And we often have to use, racialized and, gender norms that are not aligned with who that person is. And, we advise our clients, we tell them about the system, and then, ultimately we engage in client-centered lawyering to help our client, make decisions about how they want to present their narratives. But it's a reality of the way in which the immigration system is structured. And when we talk about the systems, I think we have to go back to the history of how, the political branches are given wide discretion over immigration.
Wow. Going back to the Muslim ban and thinking about how oftentimes we've seen it, political parties, we know under the Trump administration was hostile towards, Muslim community at home or abroad, or whatever way you see it. But there's a tendency to think, well, then this is just coming from the Trump camp or Republicans. But unfortunately, some of these policies have bipartisan support. And I think it's always important to go back and remember that. So even though President Biden dissolved the Muslim ban, some of the other policies like extreme vetting has remained, still trying to make it difficult for Muslims that were part of the original ban and Muslim majority countries to come to America. So how the laws are implemented, what communities, that ability to create laws that are seemingly neutral, but we know from practical standpoint how it's targeting our communities, and it aligns with the narrative that's going in, through media and the stereotypes that being perpetuated that Muslims are somehow a threat to security, and so we have to be extra careful. So, and hence the extreme vetting, and then even when you're here, that you almost expect to be to have that continued level of scrutiny under the law, whether it's immigration laws or just the normal laws of the country, because of that identity, because of that. Because of the Muslim ban and the narrative that was created that this is a community that we can't trust, it has a tendency towards violence, or will never have true allegiance to America. And I think one of, that is sometimes that's the hardest thing. Like for myself, I was born and raised in Nashville. My parents are originally from Bangladesh, yet because I'm a visibly Muslim woman of color, my allegiance is always questioned, right? And so even go outside of immigration laws, it didn't. My immigration status doesn't even matter at that point, right? There's the assumptions, the narrative that has created that can perpetuate and help sustain racist immigration laws. In 2021, the No Ban Act was passed in the House, in Congress. So that, saying if this type, of Muslim ban, travel ban, could not be a racialized act of Congress, or the president can enact something like that based on race, and if you do something, it has to have better review. But we know as presidents change, the precarity of our situation and of immigrants and coming here will change also.
I think one thing that is important to note, I think we often have the perception that things, that one administration is, better on immigration or has better policies. So certainly the Trump era of immigration was, as an immigration attorney, there were many changes, and daily we had, updates and had to shift. And at the same time, I think it's important to recognize, like back from 1996, when Bill Clinton proposed changes to immigration laws that broadened the crimes for which an individual could be removed from the United States, still has implications for today in terms of the prison to deportation pipeline and how that disproportionately impacts Black and Brown communities who are placed into criminal proceedings, and then as a result of the criminal conduct or conviction are then placed in deportation proceedings. Unfortunately, our former President Obama was known as the deporter in chief because he deported the most immigrants in the history of the United States. Also, the Biden administration has kept in place a policy called Title 42 at the southern border, which does not allow individuals to seek asylum at the southern border, which has blocked many Haitian nationals and Central Americans who would have asylum claims from presenting those at the border. And so I think it's important, I should note that, there was an announcement that the Biden administration is going to end Title 42, hopefully by the end of May. And so I think it's important to note that, in the context of the wide discretion that the political branches have over immigration, there is always a moment where we're trying to shift policies so they're more aligned with, human rights and constitutional norms.
Thank you. Thank you both. I think you both really eloquently bring forward both this, that sort of that discretion, the kind of the border discretion, and as many have faced, kind of entering the country and being asked so many questions, and I again would like to, and also you mentioned, Karla, you mentioned victimization, or the how these processes, how this endless sort of position of being a victim, and I wonder if you could also talk a little bit about maybe some most effective programs, in both of your practices. I can briefly reflect also on the 1990s Yugoslavia again, and back then I worked with a feminist pacifist group, Women in Black, and we supported, both the asylum seekers, the deserters, the refugees from all wars, and we worked very actively. We organized workshops for women refugees who then, through different channels throughout the network of Women in Black in Europe, were sold, and then there were some proceeds, and so there was this idea that Women in Black had, that each the refugees living and being in their displaced countries should not be further victimized, and so I wanted you to talk a little bit about this. This kind of, maybe what are some of the most effective programs or policies that do not further victimize the immigrant population?
I think that when you are, there are two different moments, and often the moment when you're representing someone before an immigration judge or an asylum officer, you aren't going to be shifting policy or the narratives that you need to put forth in order to get someone granted relief. I think that there are many organizations that have been working on impact litigation or policy reform, some of them here in the state of Tennessee, and the work that Sabina has been doing. Turk also does a lot of Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition does a lot of work. On a national level, the Black Alliance for Just Immigration is a really good organization that has been working on policy, issuing reports that talk about, as I mentioned before, the prison to deportation pipeline, also the ways in which Black immigrants are at the southern border receive disparate treatment. And then also, I think, the standard organizations such as the American Civil Liberties Union has always been at the forefront of, impact litigation and putting forth, challenging the Muslim ban, challenging child and family separation at the border and litigating those cases. And so I think, in terms of the organizations that, I don't think the law is like the answer to this, and often is the barrier to making changes in terms of how we perceive people, and often is complicit in that. And so I think organizations where, like Baji, that have a wide variety of people, the Black Alliance for Just Immigrants, and not just relying on lawyers, but relying on individuals who are on the ground, who are experiencing, the impact of xenophobia and racism. And then, the lawyers, listening to the community and, working from that space is, how I try to operate. But I do think there's there are two different lines, and certainly, helping someone in the crisis moment is one point of advocacy. But I think when we talk about the larger system, that there are, many ways, from impact litigation to report writing to, what we're doing here in this space that helps to kind of move the needle a little bit more.
Sabina, do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, it's that advocacy work that has to be done, because we know that oftentimes the public buys into the narrative created by the lawmakers who are crafting the policy, right? And so being able to be upfront and say how the Muslim ban has separated thousands of families, and what are the costs to immigrants or asylum seekers or migrant workers. What are the costs to them because of these policies? You know, in Tennessee has had a terrible history of just really targeting immigrant communities and going so far as to, have a lawsuit to try to stop the resettlement of refugees here in Tennessee. Luckily that failed, and then government said, okay, we'll accept refugees, but that's a constant battle, and those immigration battles then trickles down to how people are treated in the community and what kind of discrimination they do face, because with what we see with the American Muslim Advisory Council is a lot of discrimination in the workplace. And it's always tied with this idea of being an immigrant, and not just being a Muslim, but being an immigrant and what your status is and your ability to fight back because your status may be precarious or you're worried about it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and you touch upon a little bit of what I wanted to ask in terms of obstacles and challenges. I mean, we've been talking now for a few minutes about that, like about the obstacle and challenges that you face in your daily work. And I wonder, like, what are some of these really, like, maybe recent or like overall obstacles that you face daily in your work, or some of the challenges that you face, and both in our community, but also on a national level. Like, what is now, I think that the idea of what happens in our community, or also what are the right questions to ask and what are not the right questions to be asked as an immigrant, because that is something that you're constantly, and then also as a person of color, I am a white woman, but I get these questions about, like, are you a citizen, when every time I need to file a W-9 form to be paid to speak somewhere or elsewhere, or, like, what are, and then, so what are some of these most, maybe right now, some of the most pressing issues that you face in your community and in your work?
Well, for me, I mean, there are a number of issues. First of all, and I mentioned before, that kind of that otherizing, no matter how long you've lived here, the assumption that you are new to America. And there goes the praise for your perfect English. And so always seeing as the other, as an outsider, no matter what you do. And that's particularly harmful for our youth and the children growing up here, who, they don't know what back home is like. And a lot of times they've never visited their parents' home country. And so where do they belong? And so, that's always an issue. It's navigating, in Tennessee, is navigating how well can you be openly Muslim, in what spaces, because you are constantly checking yourself, where you are, who's around you, and can you speak freely about your religion or your political views. And I think checking your political views in different spaces, because we know from an immigration standpoint that could get you in trouble, and we in the Muslim community, really because of the mass surveillance that has happened, and there's a whole lawsuit against the NYPD in New York City against surveillance against the Muslim community. We know it's real. We know it happens, and so checking what you say, and what you do, you know, and how you're acting in public, because those stereotypes exist. You're always having to navigate to see how you belong, you know. And I think when you talk about second generation that are here, attitudes have changed. I say back in the 70s and 80s when, you know, like when my parents were here, you faced discrimination, but there was this all, you know, with first generation immigrants, like keep your head down, you know, don't say too much, don't rock the boat. But then, you know, myself being born here, and I'm seeing with a lot of youth, they're like, we're not going to take it anymore. And they're much more open about calling it out where they see it, that kind of discrimination or racism or anti-Muslim racism, and wanting something different, expecting something different, because you've been living here, you're part of this country, and yet you're not treated as an equal. And I think it all goes back to, how do we see each other? We should see each other as humanity. We should give everyone dignity, regardless of whether we know them or not, regardless of where they're from or their immigration status. But that's not how it functions. Unfortunately, that's not how the laws function. I don't think that's how, you know, people are brought up to see. We are categorized according to who deserves our sympathy and who does not deserve our sympathy, who is somehow at fault, and therefore, you know, saying illegal immigrants. So somehow you're criminalizing them and saying they're at fault, so therefore they don't deserve dignity. They don't deserve our empathy. But they deserve, you know, to be criminalized or have legal proceedings against them. And so it's sometimes just wanting someone to see me and give me the dignity that I deserve, give me the respect as a human being that I deserve. And it doesn't matter if you just step foot in America or you've been here for generations. Everyone deserves that.
Thank you, Sabina. Karla, do you want
Exactly. I think from the lawyer side or legal advocacy side or legal education side, there, as I mentioned before, within the state of Tennessee, there's just always been a lack of resources so that individuals can have an attorney when they are in immigration proceedings or have to go before an asylum officer. And, you know, that's been an ongoing problem for the last 15 years, is marshaling resources. Because when someone is before the immigration system in a deportation proceeding, the presence of an attorney, you know, significantly increases the likelihood that that person will not be removed from the United States. And then I think there's a larger issue, which Sabina is hitting on, which is, you know, in my role as a law professor, I always engage in conversations with my students about the ways in which the law has been complicit in creating the circumstances in which we need to, or in which brings our clients to us. And the ways in which even, you know, traditional civil rights paradigms that we use to ask for remedies are, you know, may often be complicit in, you know, perpetuating racism or continuing racism. For example, if we look at, you know, the traditional civil rights paradigm and someone who is discriminated against, we're often looking at one individual bad actor who has, you know, committed one act. If we're looking in the workplace, we're trying to remove that one individual bad actor. If we're looking at the border, and, you know, if we're talking about the Del Rio border, President Biden made statements about trying to, you know, remove men on horseback who were whipping Haitian nationals. And that individual, you know, removing them does not change the system in which that individual is operating. And so, you know, there are ways in which the law, even though the discrimination laws that we have in place, keep in place the system, and it, changes, but doesn't change in a way that, modifies significantly the rights that someone is entitled to in the United States. And so as an educator working in the legal academy, when I, teach immigration law to my students, or when we're working on cases, or if I teach critical race theory, it's, analyzing and thinking about the ways in which the legal system and lawyers have been complicit in continuing racist policies or xenophobic policies, and really critically engaging with my students on how can they, especially as future lawyers graduating, become a part of challenging those systems, or thinking of new paradigms to address the ways in which immigrants and communities of color are treated in our country.
Thank you so much, both. I wanted to maybe say something for just also as for this idea of language, and that you Sabina were talking about being, language has always been important to me. I don't speak perfect English, but then that's kind of part of who I am, part of my identity. I sort of, although I've spoken it since I was a middle school kid in Serbia. Then, in 2019, I had a chance to return to Serbia as a Fulbright scholar for a research project I was doing. And then I went and spent time there, but not as I'll go back to visit family for a week, but I spent a year, and I felt like I was there for an extended period of time. And then I had this profound feeling that I have never left. And sort of, it kind of made me really think about, again, where we started, and about that youth that you were talking about the fact that one can belong in many different places, and you don't have to feel like the other being somewhere else. And so this is more like a personal comment, but also a way of us maybe opening up for others, if there are any questions from the audience, either in the chat or from the floor. Feel free to unmute or ask, just I can't see everybody, but if there are any questions for our speakers, now would be a great time to ask. Oh, okay. So there is one question from the a couple of questions. One from Remzia Suleiman. What are some of the ways folks can get involved in supporting immigrants and refugees in Nashville? That's one question, and then I'll ask another one.
So I know, like, from the best way to start any kind of involvement is understanding the communities you want to work with. And so that your involvement isn't about taking over or shining a light on yourself, but really supporting those communities and letting them take the lead and asking them, what do they need from you? And I think that's what being a good ally is. But with the American Muslim Advisory Council, we do cultural competency trainings to help people understand the Muslim community and different immigrant communities better here across Tennessee. That being said, joining in any kind of campaign that is being led by immigrant communities, that is the way to show your support, and asking them what do they need in terms of that, and being willing to listen and check your own biases when dealing with other communities. So they need the support, but they need your empathy, but they have agency of their own. And so remembering that.
Definitely. I think some of the organizations in Nashville that are doing the work. The Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition is, one organization that you can get involved with. And Tennessee, the Justice for Our Neighbors and the Vanderbilt Immigration Clinic, we're always looking for people who can act as interpreters to help with legal representation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We don't have I don't think we have any other question. We have some great points for avoiding the savior complex.
I'm sorry, I have a question. Is that
Oh,
okay?
yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for this amazing discussion and panel. I only have one question. We have over 300 Afghan refugees the past few months came to Nashville. How your organizations that you're involved with have provided a space or a place for them to feel belonging. How you provided that kind of support for this new, immigrants to this country. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that question, because so AMAC has been working with Karla and the resettlement agencies and a whole group of organizations that are helping to support the new Afghan arrivals, and there are over 530 in Nashville, and by the end of the year there'll be another 100 more. So it's a huge community that came, and so that sense of belonging, I keep emphasizing over and over again. Like when refugees come, they need food, they need housing, they need the immigration lawyer, but really for setting them up for long-term success will be about how do they build that sense of community. And so from my work, it's trying to connect them with the Muslim community and other Afghans living here, because it is, and having them feel like there is a home, because they're always going to miss home. And I think, immigrants, missing what you left behind is just part of what it is. Nobody should have to hide it or, feel guilty about it. It's going to be there. This is the first Ramadan starting tomorrow that these new Afghan arrivals will have in this situation, away from their family, away from their home. And, tomorrow we're actually delivering gift bags to every family so they can feel that they're welcomed here, connecting them with the mosque and the different programs that are happening. Also, there are a lot of, culturally, you come here, there's a lot to learn. And it's best when they learn it from other immigrant, especially Muslim immigrants who've gone through that same, has that same history of moving here and trying to figure out how life works here. For immigrant communities, Afghans, especially the Afghans, is always, even those like my parents, when they immigrated here, and it wasn't under dire circumstances or anything, but there's always this fear of how am I going to raise my children? Things are new, different. That you had a whole support system back home, and you don't have it here. And then as Muslims, they want to make sure they raise them in Islamic traditions. How will they keep that? So these are, as again, they need food, they need housing, there are all these other items that they need, but that ability to connect with community and hear from others' experience and understand that it can work out, it can, you can raise your children, things will be a little different, but you learn how to navigate that. Building that community, I think, is just the most important tool, the most important thing that they will need to be successful a year from now, 2 years from now, and going forward.
As a lawyer, of course, I've been trying to increase the resources for to provide legal representation, working with Tennessee Justice for Our Neighbors to provide consultations to into the recent Afghan arrivals so that they can know what are the legal remedies they can pursue to remain in the country. Also, again, one of the things that existed prior to the Afghan community coming is just the lack of attorneys, and so marshaling resources on a local level and a national level to try to find attorneys for individuals, working with law firms across the city of Nashville for attorneys to take on pro bono cases has been, a lot of the work that in which I've been engaged to find representation for individuals.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Racial, my colleague at Vanderbilt Department of Art, and for asking this question. And I also want to say that when it comes to building the community, Racial has started a gallery program for with the Middle Eastern program for the entire year. And I think that is really one of the ways that we are trying and Racial to engage with the community. We are at 1 hour. And so there is one, I'm just noticing a question about somebody. I love Sabina's comment earlier about something having to check yourself, what you say. This relates to a feeling that one can't manifest one's own subjectivity, the inner world and agency from fear of discomfort. Yet this is crucial in order to shine and be who one is. I think this is really a nice a way for us to maybe wrap the conversation, which cannot be wrapped, but maybe we can continue through different ways of engagement. I wanted to thank everybody for being here, and we have placed a lot of links in the chat. And I invite everybody to check some of the scholarship, some of the links, and to be an active member of the community and in support of immigration. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.